To you the podcast Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches. We discuss a range of topics that include addictions, religious abuse, and recovery. This live platform offers meaningful questions and answers, a counseling continuum, and valuable feedback from professionals and others who have been through the process and are healed, forgiven, and reconciled. If they can achieve this, so can you. This program can be heard on iHeart, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Pandora, Apple Podcasts, and others. Make no mistake, this podcast sustains and implements three things: healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation within the Church of God. Thanks for listening.
Good day, friends. Good to have you here tonight for the podcast, Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches. Again, we're glad to have you here tonight with us. We discuss different topics. We have different platform guests on. We discuss religious abuse, addictions of all types, but our main focus is recovery. This live platform offers counseling, different sessions off and on air, and also we have a special program where you can actually call in with questions and comments about this podcast. If you want to text in tonight, you can. That number is 1-866-538-3664. Questions tonight, feel free. Number is 1-866-538-3664. Also, you can go to YouTube and just type in Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches. It will come right up and you'll see the live banner there. YouTube, Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches. We have a counseling line. You can call in. That number is 478-283-9093. Wounded Hearts counseling line is 478-283-9093. You can email us also to Wounded Hearts. That is, email address is reeeechone@AOL.com. Again, that Wounded Hearts email is reeeechone@AOL.com. So tonight, again, glad you're here. I want to introduce our staff that works with us here, friends. We have some good people who work with us here to get this podcast moving each week. And of course, we have our director. She's the founder, Mattia McLeod. She's a mother, wife, and she homeschools those 4 children. And she's director of this podcast. She's also the editor of Arise magazine. Also, Stella Cavan. She's in the Ohio area. She chimes in and helps us in the ministry here, the outreach of Wounded Hearts. She's 92 years old and been saved about 65 years, and a mother of 5, I believe it is. No, 6, I believe it is. And her dad was a pastor. And of course, in her family, they have 2 more pastors. So she's part of the process. Also, Ken Probes. He's a PK son, a pilot. He was for years in Alaska. And now he's in Joplin, Missouri area. And my name is Prince Moon, your host. So again, glad you're here tonight. Friends, the views and opinions that we discuss on this podcast don't always agree with the staff people, different ideas, traditions, and mores. But we want to discuss these things to see if we can reach out for 3 things: healing, reconciliation, and forgiveness within God's church. Make no mistake, that is our main focus here, to reach out for reconciliation, healing in God's church. So again, glad you're here tonight for that. Friends, podcasting is the way to go these days. There was 36 million. Can you imagine that each week go into podcast, listen to podcast? But we here can be heard on Amazon, Google, Buzzsprout, Poddash, Podchaser, Pandora in Review, Apple Face, SoundCloud, True Social, Facebook, YouTube, and Alexa. So again, tonight, tell your friends, special podcast tonight, talking about helping out pastors. So again, you can go to YouTube, tell your friends, and just type in Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches, and it'll come right up. So tonight, a special night. Trust me on this one. We have Dr. Tanner here, Matthew Tanner, and I'm glad he's here. We just met I've known that guy all my life. It's good, Dr. Hand, being here tonight. So glad to have you here tonight.
Wonderful. Yes, sir. Excited about it.
Wow. Wow. A
Yeah.
lot to unpack. So I'm going to
Oh,
kind of
yes.
rush a little bit. Dr. Tanner, College of the Ozarks, and he went to administrative justice and psychology.
Yes, sir.
He went on for his master's degree in divinity and theology and earned a doctorate in ministry. His lovely wife and three daughters accompanies him in this most exciting book he's written. It's called The Wounded Pastor, friends. So if you know a minister or a pastor that's been wounded, have them chime in tonight. I've been over the book, the ratings, and all of that. It's a 5-star rating. You can pick it up on Amazon, etc. Well, the question, well, Brother Moon, why did Doctor write a book? Well, it's needed. Statistics, if you'll allow me. Jim Davis wrote a book called The Church. He said 40 million stopped going to church and 10 million have been wounded in church. 40 million have stopped, 10 million have been wounded. Northwest Network and Shepherd Watchman, they say that 1,700 pastors give up their positions each month. Can you believe that? That's hard to believe. Urban Ministry says every year 7,000 churches closed. That is just shocking. There was a brand group, Barna. 42% are considering quitting. 42%.
Wow.
And there was a survey by Gravity Leadership, 27 different countries, and they said 12% of pastors are considering suicide. I know about 2 cases that happened. Dr. Tanner, what is going on? First question, why did you name the book Wounded Pastors, Hurting? Why did you name it that?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, that wasn't the title of the book when I was writing it as my doctorate of ministry project. I called it In Between because I was looking at that in between time between I've lost my ministry and now I'm seeking what God has for me to do next. But as I began to put it into what I call the human consumption mode, into writing it for publication, the more I studied the stories, the more I realized how many pastors out there are wounded. In the book, I coined a phrase, post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder. And I actually talked with a friend of mine who's a former Marine who talked about, and I asked him, I said, can pastors use this title? Am I overstepping here? And he said, absolutely not, because he said, he says a Marine, when he was deployed, he would, they knew who the enemy was, they could identify the enemy, and they had a rear base that they could go to and be safe. He said, pastors a lot of times don't know who the enemy is. Sometimes it's friendly fire. And he said, so absolutely pastors are being wounded. So that's through the journey of my own wounding and healing, talking to all these pastors. That's where I came up with the title, The Wounded Pastor.
You said some provocative things already. So according to that Marine, are there enemies in the pastor's church?
Oh, absolutely. Scripture speaks of it, tares among the wheat, and things of that nature. But we, I struggle to how to describe this. But the leadership dynamic, especially within evangelical church and across churches across the at least the U.S., I found this to also be the case many places in the world, is there's just a upside down leadership dynamic. And because of that, the pastor has become expendable to the church. And so, yeah, there's some serious dragons within the or wolves within the flock of sheep. Absolutely.
Wow.
Dr. Mr. Woods says he was not fired, but he was still wounded. And he accompanies that to Judas, how he betrayed Christ. So are the pastors being betrayed in some churches these days?
Yeah, in fact, what takes place according to the book and the ministry is a lot of times they They won't outright fire the pastor, but there's a mobbing effect that takes place. And it's usually a group, sometimes the very vocal minority who we've born and bred and raised in this church, and this is our church. And so rather than just outright fire the pastor, it's kind of a death of a thousand cuts. They continue to mob, they continue to raise up and all of the different things until they just weigh the pastor down. And that's why in the title it's unjustified termination and forced resignation, because what they do is they make life difficult enough until the pastor says, look, I just cannot do this anymore. And so they just resign out of weariness, out of just no other recourse. They just get worn out.
Doctor, is when a pastor goes through that, are they traumatized, do you think, after the process?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And I want to be careful with the word traumatized, because I do think that I do think in our society today, here's a rabbit trail. I think sometimes we throw that around a little too much. However, in the strategy of the book, the 4-step strategy and the emotional component of that, again, there is the post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder. And I talked to a lot of pastors who do go back into the ministry, and things like deacons meetings or business meetings and things like that trigger anxiety and the physiological response. The blood pressure goes up, the heart rate goes up, all of those things. And so there you work that backwards, and they are at the very least physically, emotionally, spiritually affected by it. But there are some cases, yes, I would say it goes as far as they are traumatized by the experience. That's why of the pastors that are being forced out, 60 to 70% of them, best that we can tell research, because the research is very new, 60 to 70% of the pastors that are wounded like this never go back into ministry.
Wow. Dr. Mary said the book gives a clear path to healing. Discuss in the book some of those clear paths that you discussed on other podcasts to the healing process.
Yeah, absolutely. As again, I took my own story of wounding, and what I did is I listened to the stories of about 30 or more pastors who have been through this, and out of those stories, I began to see where healing broke down or where healing took place, and out of all of that, I developed the 4-stage strategy. And it's like building a house. When this happens, you're in the basement level. And that's the economic part of the strategy, because let's be honest, you're not healing if you're not paying the bills, if you're not eating. And a lot of the times, I was trying to think of the exact number, but the vast majority of the time, if they get a severance, it's woefully short or nothing at all. So they're trying to pay the bills. And a lot of times, especially if there's a parsonage involved, they're out of a home. So, so the first level of strategy in the basement level is to try to get some sort of economic stability. And there's some preventative stuff, but we as pastors need to understand that we're in a high risk profession right now, and we should plan accordingly, meaning the possibility of losing your position is very high. So financially, you need to plan for that. Unfortunately, that's where we're at. So I detail in there how to recover and how to get back on some footing economically. Then that allows you to get into the healing process. So the first floor is the emotional. That's just dealing with the trauma of it. That's dealing with the rejection. That's dealing with the anxiety, the fear. Just those real raw emotions that this causes. Then the next floor is the spiritual aspect. That's David, when he was running from Absalom, wrote I think 12 to 14 of his Psalms, just in that short period when he was kicked out of the kingdom by his son Absalom. And it's a lot of, God, how long? How long is this going to go on? Why have you let this happen? Being real, being raw with the Lord. But David always ends it up with, "But you, Lord, are still God. You are my rock." So it's once you deal emotionally, then you do deal spiritually with those spiritual emotions. Really, the anger with God, the just I thought these were sheep that that hurt me. Things of that nature. So once you go through those three levels, then you finally find yourself in the balcony. And the balcony level is the spiritual or the leadership development lessons. And that's really the Matthew 7. How can I get the log out of my own eye? I know all of these flaws shouldn't have been fatal flaws, but yet can I still become a stronger leader? Can I become a better leader?
That's good.
What I find out is most of the pastors that go through this learn survival skills, meaning I'm not going to let this happen again. And a lot of them then become toxic leaders because they throw up walls. And so true leadership development in this process is, how can I love the sheep? How can I lead the sheep? How can I be more like Christ? How can I become a stronger leader? And that's where the redemption comes in, because God redeems the wounds and redeems the hurt, and he begins to use you again as a leader.
We'll take a break, and we're going to be back in just a moment with Dr. Tanner. If you know a minister that's been hurt, and there are literally thousands, according to the statistics here, have them chime in tonight to listen to these important facts on the wounded pastor. We'll be right back.
Greetings. Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches is a weekly podcast reaching out to the disenfranchised, disconnected, or wounded. Remember, you are not forgotten. You went through a debilitating situation. As a result, we are reaching out to you in love with forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing. We also offer an exciting magazine called Arise. It's an excellent fit for class discussions or personal devotions. Arise can be purchased through our website or by calling 478-784-7600. This podcast was designed by Church of God for Church of God. Don't go away. Stay tuned for more exciting conversations. Thanks for listening.
Dr. Tanner, you mentioned the emotional part, the spiritual, and of course, those all work together. I knew of a situation. I want to get your input on this situation. Years ago, there was a pastor who had been ministering at this place for, about 35 years. And they mentioned to him that he sometimes discourages the people. He walked out, left, and didn't come back ever since. That type of situation hurts the people and the pastor. And let me add this too. I like this book because it helps the preacher, but also the people too can get a benefit from reading this book of how to get through that also too, because the pastor's hurt, the people are also too. So what do you think about that? He just walked out, and just that adds to the shock, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's a tough one, and because what I found in my research is, and this is what's unfortunate, and I, not knowing the situation, I would assume or guess or possibility of there was some earlier church hurt before this one, and lack of healing led to the point where he just gave up. It's like, I'm just not going to go through this anymore. And as I wrote this book, almost to a person with people I talked to asked me when I was going to write one addressed to the churches. And I hope to do that at some point. But as I mentioned before, when these pastors don't heal properly, wounded pastors hurt other people if they don't heal. So I've even seen situations in my research and after where a senior pastor would do this same type of wounding to a assistant pastor.
Wow.
And
wow.
Like
Wow.
pastors doing it to other pastors, so, and I think it's, like I said, wounded wounded, how do I say this? Wounded animals lash out and hurt other animals, not saying that we're animals, but using that illustration of when you're wounded, sometimes that manifests itself in that you wound others.
Well,
And
Dr. Tanner, I hate to interrupt you, but
go ahead.
my background's in counseling also too. When you mentioned that, I had a client, he was 12 years old, and he would beat up on his sister.
Mhm.
I said, why do you do that? He said, my dad did it.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is, if I don't get healing, I can keep that abuse going on and on and on. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in counseling, I forget the exact percentage of how many have abused to become abusers, and that, I mean, this people are people. It's going to follow its way back into the ministry, and that goes back to the kind of learning the survival lessons or becoming toxic leaders. If you don't heal, your heart does become bitter toward the church, and you become toxic. And not knowing this gentleman's situation, it got to the point where he was just like, done, I'm out. And so then you leave the church with a leadership void. And I would venture to say most of the people under his ministry at that point had no idea what was going on.
Any questions from our listeners?
I do. Carrie Ann asked, what are the chances that a hurt pastor will come back into the pastoral role or back to the church at all?
Yeah, very good question. If I could just jump right in on it.
Please.
Again, according to the research, let me kind of just give the scope. There's about 4 to 7% per year in evangelical churches of pastors who are being forced out in this way. So you do the math, that's hundreds of thousands a year. Of that, the best we can tell is 60 to 70% of them never go back into ministry. Of the 30-some pastors that I interviewed, about 5 or so of them, this happened to them multiple times. So to answer that question directly, 60 to 70% of them won't go back into the church. However, with healing, and there's some really good resources starting to come to the surface and starting to develop with healing, those numbers can get better. Those who go through an intentional healing process are almost, 90 to 100% chance of them going back into some form of ministry if they take an intentional step to healing.
Dr. Tanner, if I want the book, what can I do? If someone wants to contact you, get the book, how can they do it?
Absolutely. You can go to woundedleadership.com, and the book is listed there. Of course, it's on other normal platforms that you're used to. But if you buy directly from woundedleadership.com, that helps support the growth of the ministry. But wherever books are sold, you can find it.
Friends, our time is gone. We want to have a second session, Dr. Tanner. A lot of questions to ask him, so come back next week to chime in again with this exciting discussion tonight. And it's so very much needed.
Oh, yes.
Thousands of ministers are leaving the pulpit every month, and this book can give some help in how to, reduce that number. So tonight, if you've been hurt and you're a pastor, there is help.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the emotional part of it, the doctor mentioned, the economic part of it, and of course, going from the basement to the balcony. Mm-hmm. So please come back next week with Dr. Tanner, and you'll get some more good information on the healing process. Tanner, thank you so much. To our director, thank you so much. For our listeners, have a good day.